Episode 5 The Web He Weaves. Rabinos sat just outside of the stables, perched on the wooden rail where Slippy was currently tied up and waiting for her stall to be cleaned. It was 3 days after their trip into town, and Rabineau had been completely unsuccessful in getting his master to talk about Dirkley or what was said between them. In fact, as soon as they all arrived back at the chateau, Linrem assigned Rabineau a slew of chores and vanished into the alchemy tower. Rabineau had completed his tasks and then continued to complete the daily chores that showed up, tacked to his bedroom door every morning, without ever seeing his master. Rabineau was so ravenously curious that he had even attempted sneaking into the tower when Gareth brought Linrem his meals, but the old manservant was far too quick, and he had thoroughly tanned Rabineau's hide when he had caught him. And so Rabineau took to moping around the chateau, completing his chores in a lackluster manner and awaiting his master's call. Eris broke into the shell of his thoughts when she appeared on the railing next to him, with a large and plump rat clamped in her jaws. She set the rat delicately in Rabineau's lap before sitting back and looking up at him expectantly. Rabineau could see that the rat was not yet dead. Eris had crushed the poor creature's spine, rendering escape impossible, but the wound had not been enough to end the rat's suffering. It blinked up at Rabineau, pain and panic clouding its eyes. Rabineau frowned, immediately reaching out with his will and stopping the creature's heart. "What?" Rabineau said slowly over his disgust. "In the hells was that?" Eris cocked her head to the side as if she didn't quite understand the question. "That was a rat," she responded slowly, as if she expected Rabineau needed to be spoken to in such a way. "You know what I mean, Eris," Rabineau snapped. "Why did you put it in my lap?" "You looked hungry," she said matter-of-factly, "or bored. I wasn't sure which." "So you brought me a rat," Rabineau shot back. "It wasn't even dead." "That was for the bored part," she began, cleaning her paws between her words. "Some of us enjoy playing with our food, and I, for one, certainly don't judge." "You are so revolting," Rabineau said, hopping down from the rail with the now dead rat in hand. "You know I don't eat rats, Eris." "I am still a cat, eternal or not," Eris said sharply. "Clearly you haven't figured that part out yet." "So glad you felt it necessary to remind me," Rabineau replied sarcastically while he walked the short distance to the main gate. "Wait," Eris said in alarm, jumping down and running after the young mage. "Where are you going with that rat?" "I'm taking it out to the field," Rabineau said. "Let nature have it back." Eris hissed, and Rabineau felt sudden pain slice across the back of his calves, making him yelp and spin around, looking down at the cat warily. "How dare you!" she hissed dangerously. "I hunt down the plumpest rat in the chateau for you, and this is how you repay me? I was saving that one for a special occasion, you know. The fat ones are always so juicy." "Gross," Rabineau replied flatly. "Do you want the rat back, Eris?" "Not after you killed it," she said haughtily. "What's the fun in that?" Giving Rabineau one more disgusted look, she turned and stalked away, tail held high. Rabineau sighed and examined his calves, now beating with blood where the cat had cut him. He shook his head and went out the small door set into the main gate, leaving the rat on the edge of the field before returning to the chateau and closing the door behind him. As soon as Rabineau had locked the small door, he turned to find Gareth standing there waiting for him, hands folded professionally behind his back. "Mr. Rabbit," the old manservant inclined his head respectfully, "the master has requested your presence in his office forthwith." "I really wish you wouldn't call me Rabbit, Gareth," Rabineau said in annoyance. "It is the master's wish for me to address you so, Mr. Rabbit." Rabineau sighed, nodding to himself. "Of course it is. All right, Gareth, let's go." Gareth led the way as the pair crossed the short distance to the foot of the alchemy tower. When they stood before the door to the tower, the manservant placed one palm flat on the door before grabbing the handle with his other hand. Within seconds of both of his hands making contact with the door, there was a soft click, and the door opened when Gareth turned the handle. The tower was exactly as it had been every other time that Rabineau had been here, though that didn't stop the young mage from casting his gaze over the shelves for some hint at what his master had been up to while he was locked away. Gareth was an attentive steward, however, and quickly ushered him up the steps. Rabineau had even less time to look around at what was going on in the workshop as Gareth urged him onwards. They rose past the training room and past the parlor to the only room Rabineau had yet to visit in the entire tower, Linrem's office. The office was also the only room in the tower that had restricted access. The stairs stopped at a small landing and faced a wrought iron portcullis, blocking an intricately carved dark wood door that had gleaming silver knocker and handle. Rabineau appraised the cold metal rods barring entry and raised an eyebrow at Gareth. Ego or paranoia? The older man looked at Rabineau appreciatively, but said nothing. Instead, he reached through the portcullis and gave the silver knocker a gentle rap. A soft and pleasant ringing issued from the door, rising in volume before wavering into a vibrato that warbled into silence. Just as the note faded to nothing, a small peephole near the center of the door slid open, revealing one of Linrem's wide and manic green eyes, which darted around, taking in the small landing, before settling firmly on Gareth.
Gareth?
When the mage said nothing more, the manservant inclined his head and replied, Master?
That was quicker than expected. Good, good.
He paused, seemed to be lost in thought.
Did you bring the boy?
Rabineau scoffed. I'm right here. You can see me, master. Linrem's eyes slid slowly to focus on Rabineau. He stared, unblinking, for several long moments that made Rabineau wriggle uncomfortably. Finally, his gaze slid back to Gareth.
Did you bring the boy?
He asked again. Yes, master, Gareth replied. As requested, I have procured the apprentice rabbit. Linrem stared at Gareth for another moment.
Good, good,
he muttered.
Give me a moment.
Linrem slammed the peephole shut and a cacophony of noise began emanating from the office, half muted by the door, so Rabineau had absolutely no idea what was going on. Gareth, Rabineau said slowly, is Linrem okay? You will address the master appropriately. Rabineau sighed at the stiff response. Fine. Is the master okay? Yes, came the man's only answer. Rabineau looked at the manservant incredulously and was about to open his mouth to say more when the portcullis gave a healthy rattle and began rising. Within moments, the wrought iron grating had vanished into the slit in the rock above the doorframe. Rabineau stared at the door and waited for Linrem to open it once more, but it remained shut. He stared for several heartbeats before he glanced over to Gareth, who was now staring at Rabineau. As soon as the apprentice looked over at the man, he silently inclined his head towards the door, as if to say, Go on now. Rabineau sighed deeply as he realized his master had no intention of opening the door to welcome him into the room. He wanted Rabineau to open the door himself. Closing the distance quickly, Rabineau grabbed the handle and made to enter, but the door was still firmly locked. Scowling in frustration, Rabineau raised an irritated fist and knocked.
Who is it?
His master's response was so nonchalant, one might think he had not just answered the door. You've got to be kidding me, Rabineau said under his breath before raising his voice to respond to the impossible man. It's Rabineau, master, your apprentice, answering your summons. There was a moment's pause, as if the old mage had to recall whether or not this was true.
Enter,
he finally said, the door giving an audible click. Rabineau tried the handle once more and found that it turned. He opened the door and stepped into Linrem's office. His ire at being toyed with vanished from his head when he saw what was contained within the space. A shimmering web of string hung suspended in the air. Within the web, papers, pictures, and even small items seemed to be fitted into place like an enormous jigsaw puzzle. The string going from one thing to the next and branching off in dizzying numbers. It looked like the outward expression of a complex intelligence that was also completely insane. Rabineau could tell that there was some sort of order to it all, some sort of purpose. Linrem may still remain largely a mystery to his apprentice, but for as long as he had known the man, he had never seen him do anything without purpose, however small or inconsequential that purpose may seem. It now became apparent to Rabineau why his master seemed so distant and erratic. The wily old mage was hunting. Rabineau didn't know who or what was the target of this web of tracking, but given the complexity of the web he saw weaved around the room, he had a good idea of whom it might be. The young apprentice broke his gaze from the web and looked around for Linrem, who was currently near the rear of the room, floating several feet above the floor, examining a particular string with extreme suspicion. He approached the man slowly and hailed him loudly when he was still several feet away. Linrem started and looked around wildly before his gaze fell on Rabineau. His expression quickly slid from alarm to confusion, then from confusion straight to irritation, which he shook off and replaced with one of cool scrutiny.
Rabbit,
he said.
What do you want?
Rabineau stifled his own irritation before responding. You summoned me here, master. I am only answering your call.
I did?
He asked himself.
Oh, yes, that's right.
The old man tugged at his beard, his gaze slowly sliding back up to the web around him before he shook his head as if to break a spell, and stepped down as if the air had formed a staircase for him until his feet were once more settled firmly on the wood.
Come.
Linrem motioned towards a small desk crammed off to one side of the room and nearly obscured by the web. Lin waved his hands like he were swatting away bothersome flies, and the web cleared away from the area directly around the desk. There were 2 chairs, one on either side, and the pair situated themselves silently. Finally, Linrem steepled his fingers and appraised his apprentice over the tips. He observed Rabineau for several moments before he spoke.
Do you know why I asked you here, Rabbit?
Rabineau stared at the old man, trying to discern whether or not he was joking. But deep down, he knew he wasn't. He knew the man wasn't truly that forgetful. Either he was truly distracted by whatever was contained within the web around them, or he was toying with Rabineau. Either possibility seemed equally plausible. No, master, Rabineau finally responded. I have no idea why you summoned me.
The old man said pensively. That's a shame. I was hoping you would.
He tapped his fingers on the desk and screwed up his face in concentration.
Oh, that's right,
he said, snapping his fingers as he got it.
I've been meaning to follow up with our last lesson.
Last lesson? Rabineau said, confused.
Yes,
Linrem said.
The wheels, boy, the wheels.
Oh, right, Rabineau said. Well, Eris helped me with that one.
Really?
Linrem said, seemingly generally surprised.
She never helps me with anything.
Master, Rabineau said with exasperation, motioning to the room around them, are we really going to sit here and converse about my lessons while whatever this is hangs in the air around us? Linrem stared at Rabineau blankly for a long moment.
Yes, he said finally. I don't see why not.
Rabineau sighed. Can you at least tell me what all this chaos is for?
Chaos?
Linram asked indignantly.
What in the hells make you think it's chaos?
Rabineau shrugged and motioned around the room. Looks like chaos, smells like chaos, feels like chaos, must be chaos. Linram scoffed.
You know nothing, boy.
And I'm trying to change that. Rabineau scowled at his master and crossed his arms defiantly. It was Linram's turn to sigh.
Fine,
he said softly.
If you must know, this,
he motioned to the web around them,
is how I keep track of Eredin.
Rabineau frowned and looked around at the web once more before regarding Linram. This looks like utter insanity. How are you tracking someone like this?
It's complex magic,
Linram said, sounding exhausted.
It has taken me close to a decade to gather the materials that went into this web.
How does it work? Linram puffed up his cheeks and then slowly blew out the held breath.
Like I said, Rabbit, it's complex. But if I have made my calculations correctly and cast my strings accurately, this working could tell me quite a bit about the target. Of course, seeing as the target in this instance is Eredin, it does not work as intended. In the current state of the working, the most I can see is whether or not he crosses the northern border into Galita.
Rabineau was taken aback by this answer. Why does it not work as intended on Eredin?
Because he knows that I can do this and actively blocks me,
Linram said sadly.
He can't stop me completely, but he's rendered my working into no more than an advanced warning system.
How is the working supposed to function? Rabineau asked, curious. Linram gave a face like he was attempting to explain gravity to a grasshopper.
Like I said, he replied after a moment of thought, it strongly depends on the contents of the web and whether or not the strings were cast correctly. However, if everything functioned as intended, I would be able to discern far more, like his current location, who he keeps close at hand. If done correctly, I can even eavesdrop on conversations. It all depends on the web.
Rabineau stared at Linram with his jaw slightly ajar.
How?
Was all he could manage. Linram sighed and rubbed his face with both hands before regarding his apprentice once more.
Take a look around you,
he said, motioning towards the web all around them.
What do you see?
Rabineau frowned, but did as he was told. Looking around didn't seem to reveal more than he had already discerned, though. I don't know, strings? Lots of strings linking all this random stuff together?
Oh, come now, Rabbit, Linram scoffed. I've taught you better than that.
Rabineau's frown deepened, and he stood, pacing about the space as he looked up at the web. The strings that floated through the space were nearly ephemeral, twinkling in the soft light filtering in through the windows, like motes of dust on the air. Rabineau reached out to touch one of the strings, but stopped just before he made contact. Looking over at his master, he saw that Linram had an eyebrow raised and was watching him intently to see what he would do. Rabineau didn't touch the string. Instead, he took a look at the collection of items floating within the web. At first glance, the majority seemed to be pieces of paper with things scribbled on them, documents, newspaper clippings, even pictures. But Rabineau didn't understand what the connection was. Oh! He frowned and stared at each individual paper, trying to make out the contents. And that was when it dawned on him. Everything caught in the web had to do with Eredin. The papers were first-hand accounts, handwritten correspondence, even what appeared to be a journal entry. Slowly, Rabineau regarded the other items caught in the web, those that weren't of the paper variety. There was a glove here, the left one, a feather quill there, and at the apex of the web, nearly obscured by the volume of strings attached to it, was a small stuffed bear. This all has to do with Eridan, Rabineau finally said. Linrem nodded.
Elaborate.
You have documents here, reports of sightings and border engagements. There's also journal entries that would appear to be penned by Eridan himself, as well as other letters that would lead me to believe you either have a spy in Eridan's party, or he is so confident in his superiority that he has sent you these things merely to taunt you.
Quite the observation, Rabbit, the old mage said softly. What else?
Rabineau looked back at the web and was quiet for a long moment before answering. It's not enough to have all of that information on Eridan. I would guess that the web doesn't even function at all if it doesn't contain something that either belonged to or was part of the target, like that glove or that lock of hair in the corner there.
Good,
Linrem nodded.
Good.
Rabineau waited for more, but his master was silent. Am I missing something, Master?
Actually, Linrem said, that was pretty good. You got most of the important parts, but you did forget the strings.
I can't figure out the strings, Rabineau said, his frown returning. They don't seem real.
They're real enough,
Linrem said with a twinkle in his eye. I call them will strings. Wait, Rabineau said. Like they're made of will? Like physical manifestations of will?
To put it that way would be akin to saying our bodies are physical manifestations of our mind's desire to inhabit and interact with the world, Linrem said philosophically. Kind of, but not really.
I don't understand, Rabineau said blankly.
Honestly, Linrem replied stoically, sometimes I doubt that I fully understand it either. But to say that they are physical manifestations of will is only kind of correct. Yes, they are manifestations of will magic. However, they are only in that state while they are a part of a larger working. If you were to remove all of the worldly items in the web, the strings would simply vanish, leaving behind absolutely no trace that they were ever there in the first place. Are you following?
Rabineau stared at Linrem blankly. The strings are more of a manifestation of a working than anything else. I mixed up the characters. My apologies. Rabineau stared at Linrem blankly.
The strings are more of a manifestation of the working than anything else. When you cast the strings, connecting at least two items, you cast with the intent, the will, and the sheer desire to find what it is you have lost. You must fill yourself fully with that desire while focusing on the connection between the items, because that too is critical. So, more accurately, the strings are manifestations of the caster's desire to find whatever it is. And once that desire is quenched or silenced, the web will be no more.
How does this not kill you? Rabineau asked in confusion. This has to be a monstrous and constant drain on your well. How are you able to do this?
It is neither monstrous nor constant when done correctly, Rabbit, Linrem answered sagely. I have had centuries to fine-tune this technique into what it is today. Needless to say, it has nearly robbed me of my life force on several occasions in the past, but I survived. This is seriously advanced will magic, Rabineau. I forbid you from attempting it. Workings of this size are out of your reach and will remain so for quite some time. You must master your basics before you move on to the complex.
How long did it take you to make this web? Rabineau asked.
Well, Linrem answered, You see, each web is unique in how long it takes to build because of the materials you put into them, and acquiring of new materials is always a possibility.
No, master, Ravenous said, eyes sharp. This web. How long did it take you to build Eridan's web? Linrim fidgeted in his seat and looked around at the web, wringing his hands in his lap.
That's difficult to say, Rabbit, seeing as I add new pieces to the web every so often. It's never really complete, you know.
Master! Linrim sighed, defeated.
I started building this web about 17 years ago. The majority of the web went up over the course of a year. After that, things stalled, and I've only been able to add bits and pieces ever since.
Rabineau realized his mouth was hanging ajar and closed it, softly shaking his head. None of this makes sense, master, he said, rubbing his eyes. I understand wanting to take responsibility for your apprentice, but at a certain point, what he does is not your fault. Linrim sighed again, this time seeming to deflate like a balloon.
There's one more thing that I've neglected to tell you, Rabbit.
What? Linrim looked up at Rabineau, and when he did, Rabineau could see the old man's eyes were filled with immeasurable grief and sorrow.
Eridan isn't just my first apprentice.
He paused for a long moment, and a solitary tear rolled down the side of his cheek.
Eridan is my son.